Pirkei Avot is the name given to the tractate of the Mishna that contains ethical and moral maxims. Pirkei Avot can be translated as ethics of the fathers, although the word ethics is not there in the Hebrew. The Hebrew translates literally as chapters of the fathers, and it can also be translated as the chapters of first or main principles, because the word avot in Hebrew can mean a main idea or principal idea. The book itself appears to be a kind of textbook or guidebook for judges. It was included in the Talmud in the section that came just before the code of criminal law, and that was the section that judges had to learn. And there are many things in Pirkei Avot about common sense and about being a good person, etc. It's not a consistent book, and many of the statements in it contradict each other. It's a collection of wise sayings of various rabbis. And it starts off, chapter 1, Mishna 1, with a statement of the chain of authority that leads to the rabbis. And it goes like this. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and handed it to Joshua. Joshua handed it to the elders. The elders handed it to the prophets. And the prophets handed it down to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things. Be deliberate in judgment. Raise up many students. And make a fence around the Torah. Now, the first thing we need to do is understand that this is a text that was written by the rabbis, and it's colored by that. If we read the Torah itself, there is a gaping hole in this text, because the Torah does not have the chain of tradition going from Moses to Joshua to the elders to the prophets. The Torah has the chain of tradition going from Moses and Aaron to Aaron and then to the priests. And the priests are then given the job of teaching the Torah to the Jews. And for this reason, the priests are not given an inheritance of land in the land of Israel. Rather, the priests get taxes. Everybody else pays the priests taxes, and the priests in return run the temple, and their job is to teach Judaism. So the question is, why on earth are they not in this list? The answer can be found in the Tanakh itself, in the Book of Kings, and in the statement, Chateu Yisrael, Israel sinned. Essentially, the priests failed in their job. They did not do what they were supposed to do. They became corrupt. They got diverted. They reverted to idol worship, etc., etc. And so they were not the ones who controlled Judaism. Also, in the time of the temple, there was a fight going on between the priests and the rabbis over interpretation of biblical texts, how Judaism should be formulated. And the rabbis and the priests did not agree at all on these matters. The priests were mainly followers of the high priest Zadok, and they were the Sadducees, and the rabbis termed themselves the Pharisees. Of course, once the temple was destroyed, the priests lost their political power, and they were no longer part of the picture, and the rabbis, by default, emerged triumphant. And so we have Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the great assembly. The men of the great assembly being, of course, the rabbis. The Great Assembly, we're not quite sure exactly what it was, but it appears to have been the great parliament of rabbis that sat in the temple and made the ultimate decisions in Jewish law. And we are told they said 3 things. be deliberate in judgment. In other words, if you are a judge sitting in a court of law, be very careful how you make your decisions, because how you make your decisions will affect the course of justice in the world, and justice is one of the pillars that the world stands on. So be very deliberate when you are making legal decisions in a court of law. Secondly, raise up many disciples. In other words, have lots of students. Teach what you know. Make sure that the chain of tradition is not broken, that it goes from Moses to Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the great assembly to you and on to your students, and so on and so on. Finally, make a fence around the Torah. This doesn't mean that you go out with a hammer and some wood and you stick a Torah scroll in the ground and you build a fence around it. Not at all. What it means is this, that there should be laws to protect the laws. We are familiar with this in English law, I suppose, to some degree. For example, there are laws that regulate the behavior of an adult with a person who's underage. And then there are fences around the laws, so that teachers are told that they shouldn't even touch a child. Why? Is that breaking the law? Not directly, but it might lead to breaking the law. So it's a fence around the law, a law to prevent a law being broken. And the Torah is full of laws of this nature. For example, if you were to light a match on the Sabbath, then you would have created a flame. If you create a flame on the Sabbath, then in ancient times that would be a death penalty offense. So we don't want to have somebody stoned to death for lighting a match. So we make a law saying you may not touch a matchbox. And that is the fence around the law. You can't touch a matchbox, and therefore, if you can't touch the matchbox, you are less likely to light the match. And this is just an example of that. A very Orthodox Jew will not shake a woman's hand. He will not shake her hand because he's not allowed to have sex with her if she's not his wife. So that is a fence around the law. Right? Orthodoxy will not allow a man to go into a room with a woman in private if she's not his wife. And that's also a fence around the law. Why? Because he's not allowed to have intercourse with her, and so he's not allowed to go into a room with her and shut the door. Right? So it's that kind of thing. So make a fence around the Torah. Avot 1:14 is the next text we have to look at, and it goes as such. Hillel used to say, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Yet, if I am for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when?" Well, there are at least two radically different ways of reading this text, and we're going to look at both of them here. The first way we're going to look at it is the obvious religious way of looking at it, probably the way it was intended to be read when it was written. If I am not for myself, who will be for me is a rhetorical question, and the answer to the question is God. Okay? And there's also another way of looking at it, even within traditional Judaism. It says in the Bible, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Which means, as Rabbi Akiva said, you have to love yourself. You have to care for yourself. So if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If you don't care for yourself, then you're breaking that commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you don't care for yourself, you won't have any self-love. Who will be for you? Well, maybe no one. But the answer here is supposed to be that if you're not for yourself, if you're not selfish, if you don't put yourself first, God will look out for you. God will look out for those people who are humble, those people who have anava, humility. But, says Hillel, let's say that a person thinks, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? That there's no God there, that I have to look out for myself, I have to put myself forward, I have to be selfish. Then he says, if I am for myself only, what am I? So he asked the rhetorical question, is it sufficient to be selfish? Is it sufficient to just live for yourself? What about the worship of God? What about paying attention to God's will? So Rabbi Hillel is saying that God must be central to your life, and it's not sufficient to say, if I am for myself only, that's good enough. What are you if you are for yourself? He's saying you're just a selfish person. And then he ends, if not now, when? When is the time to turn to God? Obviously not tomorrow. Today. Procrastination is the thief of time. Right? That is what he is saying. If not now, when? Put not off till tomorrow what you can do today. If not now, when? So to repeat, Hillel is saying, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when? But there's another way of reading this, a completely different way of reading this. And this is the way that a humanist Jew might read it, or possibly a reconstructionist Jew. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? That means, if I am not selfish, if I don't look out for myself, who will be for me? The question comes, what does it mean to look out for yourself? Does it mean that you put yourself first over and above everything else? Because if that is the case, of course, then no one will be for you. Or does putting yourself first imply that you are caring for others? Because the only way you can really care for yourself is if you also care for the people around you. And we can take a couple of examples from nature, and I'll talk about them in more detail later on. But there are a few examples that have been studied in nature of this kind of behavior. Bats, vampire bats, in one case study, for example, when they go out to feed, they have to eat. If they come back and they haven't eaten, they don't last very long. A bat that comes back and hasn't eaten will go to another bat and ask it for food, and it will get fed. If it doesn't get fed, the bat that didn't feed it, next time that bat needs food, will not be fed by the other bats in the colony. In other words, it's in the interests of a bat to feed the other bats that are hungry in its own self-interest, because if it doesn't, it'll get punished for it. Another example of this behavior is there's some monkeys off the coast of Cuba that have been studied, and they have a similar thing going. If a monkey finds food and it's by itself, it's got two choices: either eat the food all by itself, or it can call out to the other monkeys and let it know that the food is there. Now, a lot of the time, when a monkey finds food by itself, it will call out to the other monkeys. Now, why is that? The reason is simple, that if it does eat the food itself and it gets caught, which happens, the other monkeys punish it. They hit it, they beat it up, and they won't have sex with it either. So the monkey that hasn't shared ends up worse off. So what would a selfish monkey do? A selfish monkey would announce the food because it's in its own best interests to be part of the group. So let's go back and look at Hillel. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Well, if you are selfish in terms that you rarely are looking out for yourself, then other people will be for you. And if you are not for yourself, if you are selfish in the colloquial way of being selfish, if you're really only looking out for yourself and you're not caring about the people around you, well, no one will be for you. If I am for myself only, what am I? If you are only for yourself, if you're not selfish in the sense that you really are looking out for yourself in an entire holistic sense, that you're caring about the relationship with other people for you, then you are going to be alone, you are going to be shunned by the group, you are not going to be part of it. And if not now, when? So there are two ways of reading this, a religious way and a secular way. The secular way being that ethical behavior essentially is based on selfishness, and that selfish people care for the people around them because it's in their own best interests, and that people who don't care for people around them are not looking out for themselves. If you're yourself only, what am I? Well, you're not going to get very far, right? Number 18 is the last text we need to look at in Pirkei Avot. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, on three things the world is sustained: on truth, on judgment, and on peace. And then he brings a verse: speak the truth to one another, and render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. Now we have to understand something here, and that is that gates in the Tanakh means courts of law. So let's rephrase this proof text that he brings. Speak the truth to one another, and render in your courts of law judgments that are true, and make for peace. And that's a quote from the prophet Zechariah. So Rabban Shimon Gamliel says there are three main things that humanity, that human society depends on. And we're going to look at these, and these relate back to the 6 laws of Adam, or the 7 laws of Noah. The first one is truth. You can't have a legal system if there is no truth. If the witnesses do not tell the truth, the legal system will not work. On judgment, if there is no functioning legal system, then there can be no security. But the legal system itself can only function if there's truth. And then finally, on peace, because without peace, right, society can't function either. So there needs to be peace between people. And indeed, the rabbis say, Pashara gadol midin, that a compromise between people reached out of court, an out-of-court settlement, is of greater value than a legal judgment which forces a ruling in which one person ends up being unhappy. So peace, seek peace and pursue peace and be of the lovers of peace, say the rabbis. So Shimon ben Gamliel says there are three things the world stands on: truth, judgment, and peace. And then he brings the verse: speak the truth to one another, render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. Peace between people. Try always to aim, he says, in your legal judgments to make a society that is functional and calm and peaceful. But what's interesting about this is the value given to the law. That society is dependent on a functioning legal system. If you don't have that, you have chaos, like we have in Iraq at the present time. If the judges are not secure, because they think they're going to get shot if they don't say the right thing. If the witnesses won't speak the truth in court because they are scared of being killed. If the judges themselves will not make the right judgments because they are scared, then society will founder and will start to come to pieces at the seams. Because the world is sustained on truth and on judgment and on peace. And if you can't have a functioning legal system to enforce good behavior, then everything will fall apart. And that's what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says. That ties back to the very first thing in Pirkei Avot in Mishna 1, be deliberate in judgment. Be very careful when you make legal decisions. Right? Be very, very careful in the court of law, because courts of law are the basis of society. Now the syllabus wants us to talk about some issues that are connected with this text. The first of these issues is ethical monotheism. Now, as we've mentioned before, an ethical monotheism is a phrase invented by Nachman Krochmal, who was an early Reform thinker, and he coined this idea to distinguish what was then the beginning of Reform from Orthodoxy. That the core values of Judaism, said Nachman Krochmal, were this ethical social idea about making the world a better place. And that these ideas, of course, were based on the idea that there's one God and therefore one absolute set of rules about what must be right and what must be wrong, one natural set of ethics that the world must run by. And this, said Nachman Krochmal, is the core of Judaism. And all the things around the outside, like Shabbat and the festivals and going to the temple, all of these things were just props to keep the central part of Judaism intact and alive. And Reform decided to take away all the props around the outside and to let the core of Judaism out into the light. Ethical monotheism. And according to this view, ethics is absolute because there's only one God, and one God leads to only one set of rules and one set of what's right and what's wrong. And that society requires rules and regulations to run properly, that you cannot have anarchy, that you need rules and regulations. And this is the view behind ethical monotheism. It's a very different view to the view of paganism, where you have lots of different gods, each god representing their own powers. And in the pagan worldview, there was no absolute system of ethics. What was right and what was wrong had to be weighed up, and you had to weigh different values against each other to arrive at a decision about what's right and what's wrong. Whereas with ethical monotheism, it was more clear cut, and there would only be one absolute system of ethics of what's right and what's wrong. And this is the idea that Reform Judaism took on board, and it's also, of course, a core idea in Orthodoxy, but in Orthodoxy it's not the center of the religion, because Orthodoxy doesn't say that ethics, which is what man decides is right and wrong, is the core of Judaism. Orthodoxy says that what is right and what is wrong is what God says is right and wrong, and we might have our own ethical opinions about it, but God's truth is the truth. Speak the truth to one another, it says in Avot number 18. Which truth is that? That is the truth that God has revealed in the Torah. It's not the truth that's been arrived at through a discussion. And even when the rabbis are discussing, Orthodoxy believes that they are discussing Judaism with the Spirit of God with them. So the decision of the rabbis is the decision of God. That's the Orthodox view. The second issue that we need to talk about is the chain of tradition of the Sinai Covenant, and we've pretty much talked about that in Orthodoxy, the view is that Moses received the Torah on Sinai, and that is the origin of the Torah, and he wrote it down either on the mountain itself, or he wrote it down over the course of his life, including the part about his death, and then he handed the Torah over to Joshua. That's the Orthodox view. Maimonides says, if you think that a single letter in the Torah was not written by Moses, then you are a non-believer and you will go to hell. That's the Orthodox view, that Moses is the one who wrote down the Torah, functioning in a way as a fax machine. So God dictates the Torah to Moses, Moses writes it down, and the Torah is precisely what God dictated to Moses, letter for letter, word for word. That's the Orthodox view. Non-Orthodoxy doesn't have this idea at all. Non-Orthodoxy says that the Torah is a very complicated document. Its origins were oral, many, many thousands of years ago. It was edited by priests in the temple at various points in time. Probably the priest who did the final editing had several documents in front of him and compounded the Torah by selecting from the different documents, and this final editing seems to have taken place, according to biblical scholars, around about 2,700 years ago. And this view, of course, does not have Moses receiving the Torah on Sinai at all, and the stories in the Torah about the Torah's origins are regarded by the academic view of Judaism as mythological. So this story of Moses receiving the Torah on Sinai and handed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders to the prophets, is seen as a mythological history. We've already seen it doesn't quite agree anyway with what's in the Torah itself. But non-Orthodox Judaism would not regard the Torah as directly the Word of God. It's written down by men, edited by men, put together by men, and influenced by many things, by political needs, by religious needs, etc. That influenced what things were put in it, what words were put into God's mouth, and why God said what he said in it. Because all of these things, of course, were written by people about God. And in the non-Orthodox view, God, in a sense, is a character in the Torah, just like Abraham is a character and Moses is a character. So the chain of tradition from the Sinai covenant is not something that's accepted by non-Orthodox Judaism. However, non-Orthodox Judaism does accept the idea that there is a chain of tradition, but it just stretches back much, much further in time. So non-Orthodoxy would have the origins of the Torah much further in the past than Orthodoxy has it. Other issues that the syllabus wants us to talk about are responsibility for others, and of course that comes into number 14, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? That we need to be responsible for other people, that it's a core value in Judaism, that being right and good is a core value in Judaism. Va'asita et hayashar ve'et hatov, and you shall do that which is right and that which is good, it says in the Torah. And it says va'ahavta l'reich kamocha, and you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself, meaning that you have to care for yourself, but you have to care for other people as well. If I am not for myself, who will be for me, says Hillel. That, yes, you do need to look out for yourself, but that in itself is not sufficient. God also has to be part of the picture. Yes, other people will be part for you. That community is very important. That you cannot isolate yourself. It says in Avot you should go to a place of Torah and you should study with other people. You should not be by yourself, and you should be part of a community, and that being part of a community is seen as a very important thing in Orthodox Judaism. The other issue we want to talk about is justice, peace, and a just society. We've talked about that a little bit. One of the 7 laws of Noah is that you have to set up courts of law. The foundation of society is a functioning legal system. That is the Judaic viewpoint and the philosophical viewpoint of the rabbis, that any community of people can only function if it has rules that it's established for itself, and those rules are enforced, and that people are expected to speak the truth so that the legal system can work properly. Speak the truth to one another, render in your courts of law judgments that are true, and make for peace, to quote from Pirkei Avot number 18. I'm going to talk about issues relating to selfishness, etc., in a separate podcast, because it's quite a big issue, especially, and complicated, especially as it relates to ideas in non-Orthodox Judaism. So that will be for a separate discussion, because the ideas are quite complex. But to repeat the 3 set texts in Pirkei Avot in the chapters of the Fathers, they are, number 1, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and handed it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Number 14, Hillel used to say, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Yet if I am for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when?" Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, "On 3 things the world is sustained, on truth, on judgment, and on peace. As it is said, speak the truth to one another, and render in your courts of law judgments that are true, and make for peace."